Some people become experts at hiding their pain because they have forgotten what it feels like to live without fear. The Moretti estate was unusually quiet that evening, wrapped in the golden glow of warm lights that softened the massive stone walls and overlooked the calm waters beyond the backyard terrace. Inside, every member of the household had settled into a familiar routine. Staff quietly finished their duties, security monitored the gates, and 8-year-old Ethan Moretti had finally fallen asleep after insisting that only one person could read him his bedtime story. Naomi Brooks smiled gently as she tucked the blanket around the little boy, brushing a loose curl away from his forehead before switching off the bedside lamp. Since arriving 3 weeks earlier, the cheerful black nanny had accomplished something no professional caregiver before her had managed. Ethan laughed again. He slept through the night. He even smiled at breakfast. Adrian Moretti had noticed every change without saying much about it. He had built an empire by paying attention to details that everyone else ignored, and those instincts never disappeared simply because he was inside his own home. Standing in the hallway outside his son's bedroom, Adrian watched Naomi quietly close the door behind her. She looked exhausted, yet she still paused to straighten a frame drawing Ethan had taped to the wall before walking downstairs. There was kindness in every small movement she made, the kind that could never be rehearsed. As she reached the spacious kitchen, Naomi removed her light cardigan, intending to hang it over the back of a chair before cleaning the last few dishes left beside the sink. For only a second, the sleeve of her blouse slid lower than she expected. A cluster of fading bruises appeared along her forearm before she instinctively pulled the fabric back into place. It happened so quickly that most people would never have noticed. Adrian did. His expression never changed. He simply continued pouring himself a cup of black coffee, as though nothing unusual had happened. Naomi lowered her eyes and quietly rinsed a glass beneath the running water, hoping the moment had passed. Unnoticed, the silence between them stretched comfortably, broken only by the gentle sound of water flowing into the sink and the distant ticking of the antique clock in the dining room. Adrian finally placed the coffee cup on the marble countertop and looked toward her without raising his voice. "Miss Brooks." Naomi turned immediately. "Yes, Mr. Moretti." He studied her face for a brief moment, not searching for fear, but for the truth hidden behind her practiced smile. Then he asked a question so calm that it almost disappeared into the silence. "Who taught you to hide pain that well?" Naomi froze. Her fingers tightened around the glass before she slowly placed it back into the sink. She forced a polite smile, the same smile she offered everyone whenever she wanted a conversation to end before it truly began. "I'm not sure what you mean." Adrian did not challenge her answer. He had expected it. People who carried invisible burdens rarely surrendered them because someone asked once. They surrendered them only when they believed they were finally safe. He simply nodded and lifted his coffee. "You should get some rest." Naomi thanked him quietly before leaving the kitchen. As she disappeared down the hallway toward the staff entrance, Adrian remained standing alone beneath the warm pendant lights, staring thoughtfully at the doorway she had just walked through. He had spent years identifying deception in boardrooms, negotiating with dangerous men who lied without blinking, and recognizing fear long before it became visible to anyone else. What he had seen tonight was not guilt. It was survival. And for the first time since Naomi Brooks entered his home, Adrian Moretti realized he was no longer wondering whether something was wrong. He was wondering who had taught such a gentle woman to believe that suffering in silence was safer than asking for help. 3 weeks earlier, the Moretti estate had been searching for a new nanny for nearly 4 months. Resumes arrived by the dozens, interviews filled entire afternoons, and every candidate seemed perfectly qualified on paper. None of them stayed. Some were overwhelmed by the size of the estate. Others felt uncomfortable working under the strict security that surrounded one of the most powerful men in New York. A few simply could not connect with 8-year-old Ethan Moretti, whose quiet nature had only deepened after losing his mother 2 years before. Adrian Moretti had almost accepted that finding the right person was impossible until Naomi Brooks walked through the front entrance carrying nothing more than a neatly organized folder and a warm smile that seemed completely untouched by the intimidating atmosphere around her. She was not the most experienced applicant. She did not arrive wearing expensive clothes or speaking with rehearsed confidence. Instead, She greeted every member of the household with the same sincere kindness, thanking the housekeeper for opening the door and introducing herself to the security guard before anyone asked her to. Adrian noticed those small details immediately. They revealed far more about a person's character than any carefully prepared resume ever could. The interview itself lasted less than 30 minutes. Naomi answered every question honestly, never exaggerating her experience or pretending to know something she did not. When Adrian asked why she wanted the position, she smiled softly before answering. Children deserve at least one adult every day who makes them feel completely safe. It was not the answer most applicants would have given, yet something about the quiet certainty in her voice lingered long after the interview ended. Ethan unexpectedly made the final decision. While Naomi waited in the garden for the interview to conclude, the young boy wandered outside, holding a toy airplane that had lost one of its wings. Previous applicants had immediately tried entertaining him with games or conversation. Naomi simply sat beside him on the stone bench without saying a word. After several quiet minutes, Ethan placed the broken airplane in her hands. She examined it carefully before reaching into her handbag and removing a small roll of clear tape she carried for everyday emergencies. Together they repaired the wing as though it were the most important project in the world. Neither of them spoke very much. They did not need to. When Adrian later asked his son whether he liked the new nanny, Ethan answered with unusual confidence. "She does not make me feel lonely." Those 6 words carried more weight than every professional recommendation Naomi had received. She was hired the following morning. During her first weeks at the estate, Naomi quickly became part of the household without ever trying to draw attention to herself. She learned Ethan's routines, remembered exactly how he preferred his pancakes, helped him finish homework without making him feel embarrassed, and somehow convinced him that bedtime stories could be adventures instead of obligations. The large house slowly grew warmer as laughter returned to rooms that had remained painfully quiet for far too long. Adrian appreciated the change, although he rarely spoke about it. Still, his instincts continued observing the details hidden beneath the surface. Naomi never accepted rides home from other employees. She politely declined invitations to weekend gatherings. She always checked the driveway before stepping outside. Whenever her telephone vibrated with an unfamiliar number, the warmth disappeared from her face for only a heartbeat before she silenced the call and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Most people would have dismissed those moments as harmless habits. Adrian Moretti had spent too many years studying people to believe in coincidences, and without realizing it, he had already begun watching the woman who had quietly brought life back into his son's world. The following days unfolded with a quiet rhythm that made the Moretti estate feel more like a home than a carefully guarded mansion. Every morning, Naomi Brooks walked Ethan to the breakfast room before school, listening patiently as he described imaginary adventures, favorite books, and impossible inventions that only an 8-year-old could dream of. She never rushed him, never corrected his excitement, and somehow made every conversation feel important. Adrian Moretti noticed the difference immediately. Ethan had stopped eating in silence. He no longer asked to skip school. Even the teachers began sending messages describing how much more confident he had become in class. Naomi accepted every compliment with the same humble smile before quickly changing the subject. She never seemed comfortable being the center of attention. Adrian found that detail more interesting than the compliments themselves. Truly kind people rarely announced their kindness. They simply practiced it. Yet the more he observed Naomi, the more another pattern quietly emerged beneath her gentle routine. Every evening before leaving the estate, she paused beside the front entrance and looked through the decorative glass panels before opening the door. She never stepped outside immediately. Her eyes always searched the driveway, the security gate, and the quiet street beyond, as though confirming something invisible had not followed her there. When Ethan excitedly reached for her hand, she welcomed the gesture with a warm smile. But if another adult unexpectedly touched her shoulder, even to gain her attention, her body stiffened for the briefest moment before she quickly recovered. Most people never noticed those reactions because they lasted less than a second. Adrian noticed every one of them. One rainy afternoon, while Naomi and Ethan were building a model rocket in the family library, her cellular telephone vibrated across the coffee table. The screen illuminated with an unfamiliar number. The smile disappeared from her face so suddenly that it seemed someone had switched off a light inside her. She stared at the screen until the ringing stopped without answering. Less than a minute later, the same number appeared again. Naomi quietly turned the telephone face down and continued helping Ethan glue the paper fins onto the rocket as though nothing had happened. Her hands remained steady, but Adrian could see the tension hidden behind every controlled movement. The calls continued several more times that week, always from different unfamiliar numbers. Naomi never answered any of them. Instead, she silenced the device, slipped it into her pocket, and redirected all of her attention toward Ethan, determined that the little boy would never notice the shadow briefly crossing her expression. One evening, after Ethan had fallen asleep and the household settled into silence, Adrian stood inside his study overlooking the illuminated gardens while Michael Romano, his longtime head of security, reviewed the following day's schedule. Adrian waited until the conversation naturally ended before speaking. "I need you to look into someone." Michael closed his notebook immediately. "Who?" Adrian looked toward the dark windows, replaying every quiet detail he had observed over the past 3 weeks. "Naomi Brooks." Michael appeared slightly surprised. "Has something happened?" Adrian slowly shook his head. "Not yet." The answer lingered heavily inside the room. Adrian continued in the same calm voice that had guided countless difficult decisions throughout his life. Her background already passed every standard screening. "I am not looking for financial records or employment history." Michael studied him carefully. "Then what are you looking for?" Adrian answered without taking his eyes off the rain falling beyond the glass. "I want to know why a woman who makes my son feel completely safe has never learned how to feel safe herself." Michael Romano never asked unnecessary questions. Years of protecting Adrian Moretti had taught him that every quiet instruction carried a reason, even if the reason had not yet revealed itself. Within 48 hours, the first report rested neatly inside a slim black folder on Adrian's desk. Late that evening, after Ethan had gone to bed and the household had settled into its familiar silence, Michael entered the study and placed the folder beside a cup of untouched coffee. Adrian looked up briefly before opening the report. Every page painted the same picture. Naomi Brooks had an excellent employment history. Every family she had worked for described her as dependable, compassionate, and remarkably patient with children. References praised her honesty, professionalism, and calm nature under pressure. There were no financial problems, no criminal record, no lawsuits, and no hidden debts. She paid every bill on time, volunteered twice a month at a neighborhood food pantry, and regularly sent part of her income to help support her elderly grandmother in Philadelphia. Adrian slowly turned another page. Nothing about her life suggested recklessness or poor judgment. If anything, she seemed to carry far more responsibility than most people her age. Michael quietly continued. "I also spoke with several former employers." Adrian looked up. "Anything unusual?" Michael shook his head. "Quite the opposite. Every one of them wanted to hire her again. One family even said their children still ask about her." Adrian closed the folder for a moment, thoughtful rather than satisfied. The report answered every routine question, yet the questions that mattered most remained untouched. "What about the telephone calls?" Michael opened another document. "They all come from prepaid cellular numbers. Most of them are disconnected within days. They are difficult to trace, but there is one recurring connection." Adrian waited. The numbers repeatedly appear in the same part of Brooklyn. Adrian remained silent. Michael continued carefully. "There is also one individual whose name appears several times when reviewing her previous address history." Adrian's eyes narrowed slightly. "Who?" Michael slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. "Marcus Hill, former boyfriend. They ended the relationship approximately 8 months ago." Adrian studied the page without speaking. There were no police reports, no restraining orders, and no documented legal disputes connecting Naomi to Marcus. On paper, the relationship had simply ended. Yet Adrian had spent enough years negotiating with people who had dangerous intentions behind clean records to know that paperwork rarely told the entire truth. Michael leaned back slightly. "We interviewed neighbors from her previous apartment building. Nobody reported any criminal activity." He paused before adding one final detail. "But more than one person mentioned seeing the same dark sedan parked across the street late at night, several times each week after the breakup." Nobody thought much of it because nothing ever happened. Adrian's expression remained unreadable. Sometimes the absence of obvious wrongdoing meant nothing. Sometimes it meant the victim had simply learned to remain silent. He looked once more at Naomi's smiling employee photograph attached to the report. It was the same warm smile she wore every day while helping Ethan with homework, reading bedtime stories, and filling a grieving home with quiet kindness. Yet now Adrian understood why the smile never quite reached her eyes whenever an unfamiliar telephone number appeared. He gently closed the folder and looked toward Michael. "Do not approach Marcus." Michael nodded once. "Understood." Adrian stood and walked toward the tall windows overlooking the moonlit grounds of the estate. "Keep watching," he said calmly. "There is still a piece of this story that Naomi is trying very hard to protect, and until I understand what it is, nobody makes a move." The conversation in Adrian Moretti's study ended, but the investigation did not. Michael Romano understood exactly what Adrian meant when he ordered him to keep watching instead of taking action. Information gathered too quickly often missed the truth hidden inside ordinary routines. Over the next several evenings, Michael quietly assigned 2 trusted members of the security team to observe the neighborhood surrounding Naomi Brooks's apartment from a respectful distance. Their instructions were simple. They were not there to interfere. They were there to understand. The reports that followed revealed a pattern no background check could ever capture. Every night after leaving the Moretti estate, Naomi drove home using a different route. Sometimes she turned left at an intersection she normally passed. Other evenings, she circled an extra block before entering her street. Once she even parked half a block away and walked the remaining distance while carefully looking over her shoulder. None of those actions appeared dramatic. Together, they painted the picture of someone who had learned that feeling safe required constant vigilance. On the 4th evening, shortly after 9 o'clock, Michael received a call from one of his men. A dark gray sedan had appeared at the end of Naomi's street. It remained parked beneath a broken streetlight with its headlights off. The driver never stepped outside. The vehicle simply waited. Naomi arrived home several minutes later carrying 2 grocery bags. Before turning toward her apartment building, she stopped. She glanced toward the sedan for less than a second before calmly continuing inside, without changing her expression. To anyone watching casually, nothing unusual had happened. Michael noticed something different when reviewing the surveillance photographs. Naomi's grip on the grocery bags had tightened so firmly that one of the paper handles had nearly torn apart. Fear had become so familiar that she no longer showed it with her face. She showed it only through the smallest movements her body could no longer hide. The sedan remained parked for another 20 minutes before quietly driving away. The license plate matched a vehicle registered to Marcus Hill. Early the next morning, Michael placed the photographs on Adrian's desk without adding unnecessary commentary. Adrian studied each image carefully. One photograph showed Naomi standing beneath the apartment building light with her shoulders perfectly straight while the sedan remained in the distance. Another showed the vehicle leaving moments after she entered the building. Adrian looked at the final photograph for several silent seconds before setting it aside. "Did he approach her?" he asked. "No," Michael answered. "Did she know he was there?" Michael nodded once. "I believe she noticed him immediately." Adrian leaned back in his chair. "And yet she never reported it." Michael folded his hands. "No police reports. No complaints. No requests for help." Adrian slowly exhaled. "Because she believes nothing has happened." Michael understood. Some people waited for undeniable proof before asking for protection. Others had spent so long minimizing their own fear that they convinced themselves they were overreacting. Adrian looked through the windows toward the gardens where Ethan was laughing as Naomi pushed him gently on a swing beneath the old maple trees. She smiled every time the little boy laughed, completely unaware that someone had quietly been watching her after dark. Adrian's voice remained calm, but his decision carried unmistakable weight. "She protects my son every day without asking for recognition." He turned back toward Michael. "Now I know she has been protecting herself every night without believing anyone would notice." Michael waited for the next instruction, but none came. Adrian simply continued watching Naomi through the glass. He had finally found the missing piece of the story. It was not danger that defined her life. It was the exhausting belief that she had to face it completely alone. The decision was made before Adrian Moretti spoke a single word. He had spent his entire career understanding that the most effective solutions were often the quietest ones, and this situation would be no different. That evening, after Ethan had fallen asleep and Naomi Brooks had left the estate, Adrian invited Michael Romano back into the study. The folder containing every report remained on the desk, but Adrian did not open it again. He already knew enough. "Tell me about Marcus Hill," he said. Michael answered calmly. "No violent criminal record. No active warrants. He has changed jobs several times over the past year. He rents a small apartment in Brooklyn. There have been no charges filed against him, but his pattern of repeatedly appearing near Miss Brooks is well documented by our observations." Adrian nodded once. "That is enough." Michael understood immediately that Adrian was not referring to punishment. He was referring to prevention. "Contact Harrison Cole," Adrian continued. Harrison was one of the city's most respected attorneys, known for handling sensitive matters with complete discretion. Have him review everything we have documented. If there are legal options available to protect Miss Brooks without placing additional pressure on her, I want every one of them prepared before sunrise. Michael wrote nothing down. He never needed to. Adrian continued. "Also speak with Daniel Foster." Daniel had spent more than 20 years working as a licensed private investigator whose reputation depended on gathering facts that could withstand legal scrutiny. Every photograph, every timeline, and every observation would be organized properly, leaving no room for speculation or exaggeration. Finally, Adrian added one last instruction. Arrange a meeting with Captain Ellis tomorrow morning. The veteran police captain had known Adrian for years through charitable foundations and community safety initiatives. Their conversations always remained professional, but Adrian trusted his judgment. "I want him aware of the situation in case Miss Brooks ever decides she wants official assistance. No pressure, no unnecessary attention, just preparation." Michael looked at Adrian for a moment before asking the only question that mattered. "Should Miss Brooks know any of this is happening?" Adrian slowly shook his head. "Not yet." He walked toward the tall windows overlooking the dark gardens where only a few landscape lights remained illuminated. "She has spent too long believing every decision would be taken away from her. I will not become another person making choices for her." Michael quietly nodded. That single sentence explained everything. Adrian was not trying to control Naomi's future. He was making certain she would finally have one. Throughout the night, telephones rang across different parts of the city. Harrison reviewed legal options. Daniel organized documentation. Captain Ellis quietly received information that might someday help protect a woman he had never met. Before dawn, another conversation took place that Naomi would never hear. Marcus Hill received formal notice from an attorney representing significant legal interests, informing him that documented evidence connected him to repeated unwanted appearances near a private residence, and that any further contact, surveillance, or attempts to approach Naomi Brooks could result in immediate legal action supported by witness statements, investigative records, and law enforcement cooperation. Nothing dramatic happened. No raised voices echoed through the night. No threats were made. No doors were forced open. By the time the first rays of sunlight reached the skyline above Manhattan, Marcus understood that every quiet step he had taken had also been quietly observed. When Naomi arrived at the Moretti estate later that morning, she greeted Ethan with the same warm smile she always wore, completely unaware that while she had been sleeping, someone had used influence. Not to seek revenge, but to build a wall between her future and the fear she had carried for far too long. The first change was so small that almost anyone else would have overlooked it. Naomi Brooks reached for her cellular telephone during breakfast to check the time before helping Ethan gather his schoolbooks. For weeks, every unfamiliar number had been followed by another, then another, until silence itself had become something she no longer expected. That morning, the screen remained empty. There were no missed calls, no unknown numbers, no messages waiting to be ignored. She stared at the display for several quiet seconds before slipping the telephone back into her pocket without saying a word. The day unfolded like every other. Ethan laughed while explaining why dinosaurs would have enjoyed peanut butter sandwiches. Naomi smiled as she packed his lunch, walked him to the waiting vehicle, and waved until it disappeared beyond the front gate. Yet something inside her remained unsettled. Peace felt unfamiliar. By late afternoon, she realized another detail she had not expected. When she drove home after finishing work, The dark gray sedan never appeared behind her. She checked the rearview mirror once, then again several miles later. The familiar vehicle was nowhere to be seen. At the apartment building, she stood outside for almost a full minute before unlocking the entrance. For the first time in many months, she walked upstairs without listening for footsteps behind her. The quiet felt almost impossible to believe. The same pattern continued throughout the rest of the week. No telephone calls. No unfamiliar cars waiting across the street. No uneasy feeling each time she unlocked her apartment door. Instead of relief, confusion settled into her thoughts. Fear had become such a permanent companion that living without it almost felt unnatural. One evening, after Ethan had fallen asleep during the final chapter of his favorite adventure novel, Naomi quietly closed the bedroom door and found Adrian Moretti standing alone beside the library windows, reading through several business reports. He looked up as she entered. "Everything went well today?" he asked. Naomi nodded slowly before answering. "Actually, something is different." Adrian closed the folder in his hands. "Tell me." Naomi hesitated. She had spent months refusing to burden anyone with her private life. Yet something about Adrian's calm presence made silence feel unnecessary. She lowered her eyes for a moment before speaking. The call stopped. Adrian remained completely still. "And the car that used to wait outside my apartment is gone." Several seconds passed before she continued in a voice barely above a whisper. "I keep expecting it to come back, but it never does." Adrian listened without interruption. There was no surprise on his face, only the quiet patience Naomi had come to recognize. She released a slow breath. "I never told anyone because I thought nobody could do anything about it. After I ended the relationship, Marcus never threatened me directly. He simply kept appearing wherever I lived, wherever I worked. He never crossed a line that seemed serious enough to report, but he always made certain I knew he was there." Her hands tightened gently around one another. "After a while, I stopped feeling safe anywhere except when I was taking care of Ethan." Adrian's expression softened almost imperceptibly. "That is an exhausting way to live," he said quietly. Naomi nodded. "I forgot what normal felt like." She looked toward the dark gardens beyond the windows before speaking again. "Now everything is quiet, and I do not know why." Adrian held her gaze for a brief moment before answering with complete sincerity. "Sometimes silence returns because the right people finally realize they are being watched." Naomi did not fully understand what he meant, but for reasons she could not explain, she believed him. And for the first time since walking into the Moretti estate 3 weeks earlier, she allowed herself to wonder whether safety was not simply a place she visited during work, but a future she might finally be able to call her own. The weeks that followed did not transform Naomi Brooks overnight, because real healing never arrived all at once. Instead, it appeared quietly in the ordinary moments she had almost forgotten were possible. One cool Saturday morning, she took Ethan Moretti to a neighborhood park while Adrian remained nearby answering business calls from a shaded bench overlooking the playground. For the first time since joining the Moretti household, Naomi found herself watching Ethan instead of constantly scanning every passing vehicle or unfamiliar face. She laughed when he insisted he could climb the tallest play structure by himself, applauded when he reached the top, and realized only afterward that nearly 20 minutes had passed without fear interrupting her thoughts. The discovery caught her by surprise. Peace was slowly becoming a habit instead of an exception. Back at the estate, the changes continued in ways that seemed almost invisible until someone looked closely. Naomi no longer hesitated before stepping through the front gate after work. She answered the house telephone without her voice tightening. She accepted invitations from the kitchen staff to share coffee before heading home, instead of politely declining every conversation. One afternoon, the housekeeper smiled warmly after noticing something that almost made her emotional. Naomi had arrived wearing a short-sleeved blouse for the first time. The fading bruises had disappeared, but more importantly, so had the instinct to hide every inch of herself. No one commented on the change. Respect sometimes meant pretending not to notice what another person was finally ready to leave behind. Adrian noticed it anyway. As always, he said nothing. That evening, Ethan proudly presented a school essay about the person he admired most. Naomi expected him to choose his father, a favorite athlete, or perhaps one of his teachers. Instead, the little boy handed the paper directly to Adrian with a grin that filled the room with warmth. Adrian quietly read the final paragraph before looking toward Naomi. Ethan had written, "Miss Naomi makes people feel safe even when she thinks nobody notices. She fixed my airplane. She reads funny voices in every story, and she always tells me that brave people are kind first. I want to be like that when I grow up." Naomi covered her mouth with trembling fingers as tears gathered in her eyes. She had spent so much of her life believing fear had defined her that she never realized what other people actually saw when they looked at her. They saw patience. They saw kindness. They saw someone who made a lonely little boy believe the world could still be gentle. Adrian carefully folded the essay before handing it back to Ethan. "I think your teacher will be very proud of this," he said quietly. Ethan nodded happily before running upstairs to finish his homework. Silence settled comfortably across the room after he disappeared. Naomi looked toward Adrian, her voice almost unsteady with emotion. "I spent so long believing I had nothing left to give anyone." Adrian met her eyes with the same calm certainty that had never wavered since the day she arrived. "Fear convinced you that survival was your greatest achievement," he said. "But even while carrying that weight, you gave my son something I could not buy with all the resources in the world." Naomi looked down at Ethan's essay resting in her hands. For the first time in years, she understood that the strongest part of her had survived every difficult season without becoming bitter. It had remained gentle. And as the evening sunlight poured through the tall windows of the Moretti estate, she realized healing was not becoming a different person. It was finally allowing the person she had always been to live without fear. 6 months passed, and the Moretti estate no longer felt like a place marked by quiet sorrow. Laughter echoed through the hallways more often than silence. Ethan Moretti greeted each morning with the excitement of a child who finally believed happiness could last, and Naomi Brooks carried herself with a confidence that had nothing to do with perfection and everything to do with peace. She no longer checked every window before leaving the house. Her telephone no longer filled her with quiet dread. She had resumed visiting old friends, enrolled in evening classes focused on early childhood development, and even began volunteering with a local organization that supported women rebuilding their lives after emotionally difficult relationships. She never shared her own story during those visits. She simply listened with the same kindness that had always defined her. One autumn afternoon, Adrian Moretti hosted a charitable gathering at the estate for families benefiting from several education programs his foundation quietly supported. Business leaders, community organizers, teachers, and local officials filled the gardens while children played across the wide green lawn beneath strings of warm lights. Naomi moved naturally among the guests, helping organize activities for the children and making certain every family felt welcome. Watching from a distance, several visitors assumed she had spent years managing community events because of the calm confidence she brought to every conversation. One guest eventually approached Adrian with a smile. "Your family is fortunate to have someone like her." Adrian looked toward Naomi as she knelt beside a little girl who had become upset after dropping an art project, patiently helping her rebuild it without making the child feel embarrassed. A quiet smile appeared across his face. "We are," he answered simply. Later that evening, after the final guests had departed and the staff finished cleaning the gardens, Ethan walked into the library carrying a framed photograph taken during the event. The picture showed him standing between Adrian and Naomi, all three of them smiling beneath the autumn trees. "Can we keep this here?" he asked hopefully. Adrian studied the photograph before placing it on the bookshelf beside several treasured family pictures. "I think it belongs there," he replied. Ethan hugged Naomi tightly before racing upstairs, leaving the two adults standing in the peaceful room. Naomi looked at the photograph for several moments before speaking softly. "When I first came here, I thought I had been hired to take care of one little boy." Adrian folded his hands behind his back. "And what do you think now?" Naomi smiled with quiet gratitude. "I think we helped take care of each other." Adrian nodded once. There was nothing more that needed to be said. Neither of them spoke about the legal letters, the careful investigation, or the quiet decisions made before sunrise months earlier. Naomi never learned every detail of what Adrian had arranged, and Adrian never expected gratitude for actions he believed were simply the right thing to do. Some acts of protection were never meant to become stories. They were meant to become peace. As evening settled over the estate and the last golden light disappeared beyond the trees, Naomi looked across the grounds without searching for danger, because there was none left to find. She no longer measured every tomorrow by the fears she carried yesterday. She measured it by the child whose laughter filled the house, by the purpose she had rediscovered, and by the quiet respect of a man who had never tried to rescue her, only to remind her that dignity was never something she had lost. It had simply been waiting for the day she finally felt safe enough to carry it again.